Today we're analyzing one of your laps on Track Titan. Now if you want us to check out your laps in one of our upcoming videos, share the session you want us to look at in the comments down below and maybe we'll review yours next. But today we're analyzing a mighty fast lap from Sephirical on the Red Bull Ring. Now Max, who is an instructor at Porsche, and me are gonna analyze the little details that can be improved for an even better result. Sephirical, his best lap is a 105.146, almost a second slower than our community's fastest lap. We see that he's losing a lot of time in the slower corners.
Yeah, definitely, and you can see kind of looking at his theoretical best. So if he put all his best corners together over that session, he'd actually only be half a second. So there's at least 4 tenths in that lap time.
Yeah.
What you can see, what immediately jumps out to us is kind of, okay, there is 2.5 tenths in turn 1 alone, which is really not that complicated a corner. And also in turn 3. And turn 3 has some really peculiar elements to it. But you kind of see a pattern, right? There's a bit of time loss everywhere, but it's a lot in the slow corner, as you'd expect, because you lose a lot more time in slow corners in general, simply because you spend a lot more time in them. Let's jump into segment 1, right? A lot to do differently in there. So let's look at it. So first of all, looking at the speed chart, right? You can see in this case, Sephirical, the user is actually slower throughout the corner at every point. And let's look at their lines, really similar, right? You kind of see, if you look really closely, the entry, I would recommend being a bit wider, so you can see the best person on the platform right now on Track Titan uses really the full curb all the way to the track limit. Yeah. Whereas Sephirical in this case stays a bit more narrow, but really it's in the detail, right? So not too much difference here. But one thing that I found really interesting, actually, you can see there's a time loss all the way from the start of the lap to the first corner.
Yeah, so I think that means that his exit from the previous corner wasn't optimal or as optimal as the community's fastest lap, right?
Definitely, that's one thing, and I would say that could be one thing, but I would assume that because the loss gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that actually in this case Sephirical is running too much aero.
Oh, yeah, that could be it as well.
In general, the Red Bull Ring is a relatively low aero track because it has long straights and slow corners, of course, some fast corners. But ultimately, that'd be the first recommendation. Let's analyze the other segments first to come to that conclusion. But my hunch is probably a bit too much aero. Then we come, and you can see that, right? If you look at the diff to ref, the delta, so how much where they're losing time is linearly increasing. So you can really see the impact of there's just not enough steam at the end of the straight. Right. Then we can see a big time loss under braking, actually. Right? This is where it goes up. And what happens is you can see they brake despite the lower speed at pretty much exactly the same point. Let's look at the braking. So in this case, Sephirical, let's keep in mind, is about 10 kph slower and has more aero probably, but still brakes a bit earlier. So it's definitely a bit of braking they can work on. And then you can see the final detail, the best person on the platform, in this case, brakes a bit deeper into the corner all the way to the apex, where Sephirical lets off the brakes a bit too soon, right? So obviously in the details, but you can see that makes up almost 2 tenths in this case, or a bit more than 2 tenths, in fact. Cool. Then let's go through the other segments. You can see segment 2, which is really just and turn 2 on the Red Bull Ring as well. Really just a straight.
Again, you can see it again, that speed fall off, because probably the aero.
Absolutely. Right, and that's a key thing. You can see it just growing and growing. Same story probably again. Yeah, the diff to ref, it just grows. And obviously, you look at both folks. In this case, this is high level driving, right? Nothing changes the throttle; it's just flat out. So really, you shouldn't be losing time here. So ultimately, this is definitely an aero problem. However, one thing I have to say, you can kind of see one thing, right? The speed difference dramatically gets bigger towards the end.
Yeah.
Again, almost 8 kph. And there is actually tiny line difference if you look closely, right? You can see Sephirical in orange tries to take the shortest route. But what that means is, yes, it saves you a few meters, but actually this left-hand kink, even though it is easily flat out, it costs you a bit of time the more you have to steer. So what the blue does is staying out a bit wider and basically minimizes the friction of turning through that kink on the way to turn 3.
Yeah, so they scrub off less speed because they don't have to turn as much.
Exactly, and it's minuscule, right? But you can see it a bit towards the end, right? The curve starts climbing a bit more and more, which really shouldn't be the case, right? Usually, even though you have an advantage coming onto a straight, that usually gets smaller and smaller with time. So a mix of aero and staying more to the right before that left-hand kink. That would be my recommendation there. Let's move to segment 3, another big one. A lot of time loss, so 210s. Let's keep in mind this is pretty much more than 20% actually of their entire lap time loss. So a lot of ground to get here.
Yeah.
First thing, what would you say, Quentin? What jumps out at you looking at the charts?
Well, of course, the lower speed is probably caused due to the aero and the scrubbing off of speed due to the shallower line. And I also see that they brake just a tiny bit earlier. Can you zoom in onto the racing line a little bit?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, it's pretty much identical, so there's not much going wrong there, I think.
Yeah, agreed. The line is absolutely spot on, right under braking. And this is a thing in the F1 games, you can brake a bit on the curb, so that's actually in real life you wouldn't do this into this corner. But definitely you can, and it's quite interesting, right? If you look at our Track Titan focus zone, really, even though the line is a bit different around the apex, there's not really much time gained or lost around here, right? Yes, the narrow line can work in taking the curb, but it's quite risky because it can unsettle the car, right? So you can see in this case, Sephirical takes a wider line, but actually in terms of the speed impact, is close to non-existent.
Yeah.
Right. Once we're actually at the apex, like there's a bit of a time loss. Probably, I would say, turns a bit more if you look at the steering wheel at the top. So definitely turns a bit more on the apex. But once they exit the corner, actually has a bit of a better exit, right? Despite a wider line.
Yeah. So most of the gains in this corner is before the apex even.
Exactly. All about braking, right? This is a heavy, long braking zone. So again, aero, less aero. And then despite the higher downforce setup, he seems to have to brake a bit earlier. The thing is, if you look at the orange line, it doesn't actually come to the minimum speed earlier. If that was the case, then he could get on the power earlier and have a better exit. But in this case, you end up with the exact same apex speed, right? Extremely close, 74, 76, but you're sacrificing all that braking distance.
Yeah.
So a bit later on the brakes, look at braking technique as well a bit. Yeah, very different, right?
Yeah.
I would assume that Sephirical in this case is driving without ABS maybe, which is why he attempts to trail brake. But if you think about this, right, at this case, you're still at a lot of speed, right? Let's actually look at the speed as part of the braking phase. So still at more than 200 kph, but you can see that he's already trailing off the brakes quite a lot, right? Down to 70%. And at that speed, the car still has a lot of downforce, right? And I think that's exactly why the driver, Community Fast, is able to stay on the brakes and then trail off only towards the meters where he actually starts turning in. So a bit more about optimizing, turning and braking and trail braking only when you have to do it, not before when your car's still in a straight line. Let's get down to segment 5, so that's turn 4 on the Red Bull Ring. Really tricky downhill corner, a lot of understeering usually. And this is an interesting one, right? You can see, focus on again on the entry and braking. I think the same story that's obvious to the viewers as well now. Aero towards the end of the straight, but again braking earlier. But then let's actually look into this. I find really interesting, right? You can see the speed graph around the apex quite different between the two.
Yeah.
Like one quite round and one much more pointy, and that's a critical thing. I would love to kind of see how they brake and how that makes a difference. Sephirical comes off the brakes a bit earlier, right? And it goes to zero brake pressure quite early.
Yeah.
And what that means in this case, right, you can see both of them are actually not fully at the apex yet. This just before, right? So you can see the fastest person on the platform still applies 34% brake pressure. What that means is they put a bit more weight over the front tires of the car, which means it rotates towards the apex a bit better, right? Whereas Sephirical, in this case, I would assume actually struggled with understeering. If you look at also the steering wheel at the top, right? Look how much he has to turn to get towards the apex. Downhill corners, in general, you tend to understeer. And if you then also don't trail brake, you're basically robbing your front tires of grip, right? And this is exactly what happens here. And this is kind of a classic understeering speed curve, whereas the blue curve really slows down nicely till the point, rotates the car, and instantly gets on the power. So that
higher minimum speed from Sephirical is only caused because they experience understeer. They don't slow down enough to get back on the throttle as early as the Community's fastest.
So really, yes, they gain a bit of time on the entry, but really only because they don't have control over the car in a way, right? That they would want to. They can't rotate it, they can't stop enough. And this is exactly why the blue line actually in this case isn't doing it perfectly, but look how early they can come on the power, right? Then probably a bit too aggressive, maybe some wheel spin. But ultimately, if you look at the story of the diff to ref, right, losing a lot of time, of course, on the entry, braking too early, right? But then also once they're at the apex, then on the exit, keep losing time again and again because of that. And that's exactly the issue, right? This mid-corner understeer ruins the entire corner. All right, let's go to segment 6 on the double left-handers. Again, this one downhill, really, really tricky. I mean, it's quite interesting, right? You've got 13 thousandths of a second between them, but very, very different shapes ultimately.
Yeah.
What would you say from your standpoint? Like, what do we see characterized here?
Yeah, of course, the earlier braking again, but I think Sephirical has a higher speed later in the corner because he experienced the benefits of that arrow, I assume, because these are pretty sweeping corners. So I think that downforce really helps with getting through them at a higher speed. But then again, when they get back on the power, at the end of the speed chart, that they kind of are at the same speed again. So I think it's just a different approach to a corner, depending on their setup.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite different. Both seem to work-ish, right? I would say if you look at the line on the exit, Sephirical tends to understeer a bit, and that's probably costing the speed around here, but not really being able to put the power down as much. And you can see this here, right? Like, yes, the faster driver drops the speed earlier, but ultimately to a similar point, but because they do it earlier,
can get back on the power earlier. Yeah.
Here we got another 1/10 and a half. Let's look at the speed first and the lines. So turning in a bit earlier, it seems, and then running a bit wider. Interesting, right? So probably not the ideal line. Probably should have waited a bit, take a wider line on the entry to have a more straightened exit. But the details quite nuanced. What I find really interesting is, right, that in this case, we know the blue driver probably has a lower downforce setup, but they're able to keep a higher minimum speed. So in this case, we have a minimum speed of 205 kph in blue, right? And then Sephirical with a higher downforce setup, 203, 204. So extremely similar, but at very different points of the corner, right? And that's the thing. You can see it's really, there's a lot more aggressive braking in the faster lap. You can see this, right? They slow down really quickly.
Yeah.
And then get punchy on the throttle as early as the front grips. Where Sephirical, you can see the orange line goes down a bit wavy, a bit more slowly. And then because of that, obviously he has a higher speed, needs to wait and wait and wait. Look at the power application now, for instance, right? Reference lap already almost at full throttle. Sephirical still at 0 because they were a bit too ambitious on the entry to the corner.
Yeah.
So I think that's a story that we saw before, right? More punchy braking, a bit deeper into the corner. And you can see this here, right? Blue line, much more brake pressure.
Yeah,
and also,
for sure.
You can probably see Sephirical struggle. They braked initially, wanted the front to grip, realized, damn, it doesn't grip as much, and then a little extra dap on the brakes, which is okay, that's the right reaction. But ideally, you have one kind of smooth motion, right?
Yeah.
All right, coming to the end, 2 final corners. Here we got about a 10th. That's the thing, right? In fast corners in general, you don't actually lose that much time just because they're really quick. They go by quite quickly. So probably not too much to gain, but again, right, you approach it with quite a lot of speed, 300 kph, and we see it again, arrow, very clearly.
And it's interesting that in this corner, we see Sephirical's speed actually drop below our reference lap, because I would assume in these faster corners, the arrow would help him keep his speed up, but maybe he does something with his braking. We have to check it out still. That makes a big difference in that way.
Absolutely. There shouldn't be a reason, right, to have a speed difference of 10 kph here with the higher arrow. So let's see, I would assume a bit, actually not braking, that's interesting, right? Initially braking quite little, but then coming off and realizing, damn, that was not enough. Similar stories in the corner before. Yeah. That's the thing, I think Sephirical in this case, if they would have followed a similar kind of up and down motion like the best community lap here, they probably would have been able to keep a higher minimum speed. In this case, you can see Sephiricals in gear 6 versus 7, so it's just things got a bit messy. But again, within a 10th of a second, right? So not the end of the world. But I think that this should be an easy win, to be honest, for him as a driver. All right, and then final corner. Let's check it out. The very final corner, let's look at the speed first. Racing line, extremely similar. Again, maybe could be a tiny bit wider. And that's the thing, right? Once you're at that level, this really matters. Those extra centimeters over to the left. We're staying within track limits. But line-wise, really solid. But again, slightly lower speed, of course, because of the worst exit from the corner before. But only a short matter of time. But again, right, much lower minimum speed, which there really isn't any need for, considering the higher downforce setup. I have to say the community fast is really outstanding, like how smooth they come on and off the brakes.
Yeah.
In the high-speed corners, quite impressive. And again, this is tricky, right? Happens to me as well. Like you brake initially, you're not sure, can you let go, maybe adapt more? Better than to overshoot the corner completely, right?
For sure.
So the reaction, I mean, we've all been there, right? It's kind of, do you let go and hope for the best, or do you give a little nudge on the brakes again? So in that case, the right reaction, but you can see, right, in the focus zone as well, because of that extra maneuver, then suddenly he loses all the time. So let's check out actually what's the time difference. Because of that, A, slows down too much, right? And then it's crazy the time loss once that happens, right? So
it just goes up and up and up.
Exactly. So this is interesting, right? This kind of the moment, lose a bit of time on the braking, then it's that moment of, I'm coming off, and it's like, actually I'm coming back on, and then shit goes down, right? And that's exactly what happens, that because of that, you don't have the grip on the front tires and you can't apply the throttle as early. That's what I assume is happening here. So to be honest, the community fastest lap, really poor actually on the exit, a bit too aggressive, but that initial momentum, that was enabled because of the better braking before, right? Then they were a bit too ambitious and actually couldn't pull through. So I think in terms of throttle application, Sephirical was much better here. It's just the speed difference was so severe already that they couldn't make up that speed. And then, of course, again, you see slightly, the speed just gets...
Yeah, they slightly pull apart.
So tiny differences, but making up almost a second around the lap. But the beauty is obviously, we know that Sephirical's theoretical best is actually about half a second quicker. So there's a lot to gain. Main tips would be about punchier braking and not coming off too quickly, and actually making use of the arrow, right? Actually being comfortable with turning into those corners a bit faster and then getting on the throttle as soon as I can.
Yeah. Would you say it's making more use of the arrow or experimenting with a less arrow dependent setup?
I would say, like changing it to a less arrow dependent setup is the easy quick win, right? Keeping everything the same, they will be able to, even with lower downforce, to keep their current speed 100%, right? Because we know there's a margin, plus you get that benefit down the straights. So that's definitely step one. But then driving wise, right, it's mainly about braking practice. So I definitely recommend just practicing the same corners again and again and again, and really analyzing your brake taste. Something you can do as well, just standing still in the game, getting on the brakes and seeing how the red bar actually comes up and down, right? So it's not up and down, but really up and smoothly down, to get that muscle memory into your left leg.
Oh, that's a really good one. All right, but that's the lap, I think. Thanks, Sephirical, for commenting on the video so we could analyze your lap, and I hope you can learn something from our analysis as well. Is there anything you want to say to the viewers, Max?
No, just thanks for tuning in. Hope that was helpful. And if you guys want to get your lap analyzed, then just post in the comments down below and we'll pick a lucky winner for the next one.